Hello, everyone. So, Aimee, just to get us started, you're with Foundation for Responsible Robotics.
Yep.
And something in that name suggests that there's such thing as irresponsible robotics.
Right.
So, tell me a little bit about that.
Right, and of course, I'm not suggesting that the way we proceed with development right now is irresponsible, but really the Foundation for Responsible Robotics is looking at how we can pave the way forward. What does a future of robotics look like that could be done in a responsible way, and what does this mean? So really, we're looking at exploring what this means in terms of design, development, use, implementation, regulation, so the entire life cycle of the actual robot.
Okay. And then today we're specifically going to be talking about robots in the home and different ways that they are being implemented, different ways that they could be implemented, and some of the issues that arise out of that.
Right.
So pick a room of the house and tell me about what's happening there.
Right. So, and I should also say, the role of a robot ethicist, or the role of the ethicist, is to look at this concept of the good life, right? And how a robot fits into our concept of the good life, or how it may change what the good life means for us. So sometimes it means taking a more critical stance, but it also means, looking for the good and trying to steer us in the direction of the good. Okay, so if we're looking at robots in the home, we could think of the children's room. So we could think of robots specifically designed for children. And of course, you have incredible tools like Lego Mindstorm and the robots that are helping children to develop skills for programming and things like that. But you could also look at more controversial applications of robots, and one of those is the Hello Barbie. And with this robot, one of the issues we might flag is security. So what kind of practices does a company go through in order to ensure the security of the system, that it can't be hacked, that it can't be taken over, that the data that's collected isn't taken and used for other malicious purposes? So I would say, and of course, this isn't the only issue, and it's not like security only relates to this one application of robots, but this is one of the most prominent issues to flag for this application because it's such a vulnerable demographic, our children.
So let's give people a picture of Hello Barbie, in case they don't know. Pink, plastic, blonde, microphone connected to the cloud, capable of having conversations with children.
And learning about their user, being able to engage in conversations, learn about preferences and things like that of the user so that you can interact. Hi, Aimee. Hi, James. How are you today? Yeah.
And
this was taken over, right? It's hooked up. I mean, it's AI. It's considered embedded AI, and so it's hooked up to the internet, to your Wi-Fi connection. And it was shown, by U.S. computer scientists that this could be hacked. And so they were able to take control of the microphone or collect the data that had been acquired through the Barbie.
Now, how does this happen? This is supposed to be a fun toy that talks about horses and favorite colors.
Right. How does what happen? How does the
security breach happen? What are the practices that might lead to this kind of a lapse?
Well, the security breach really has to do with the fact that the robot isn't a black box, right? It's not, the data that's collected isn't just staying within the system. It's shared. It's going over the internet. And so that's how that's how you're able to hack into the system. Gotcha.
Okay, let's move to another room of the house. How about the living room? What ethical issues do we face with robots there?
Okay, so for the living room, we could think of a cleaning robot. We could think of something like Roomba. And I mean, this is a very practical tool. This is helpful. This is helping us vacuum our floors. There isn't too much in terms of human-robot interaction. Do we have to worry about how intuitive the interaction is or questions like that? But one of the issues that we might think about when we're considering this kind of robot is transparency practices of the company who's making and distributing the robot. So with the Roomba, which is made by iRobot, they were talking recently about selling the floor plans or selling the data that's collected from the robot to a company like Amazon. And of course, this is helpful in terms of making the robot more efficient, and you can have robots interacting with one another, which helps with the user experience. But you have to wonder how this information is communicated to the user and whether or not you're asking permission to collect this kind of data, whether there will be consequences. Sometimes when you go onto a website, if you don't accept the cookies, you can't go any further on the website, or if you don't accept the terms and conditions, you can't go any further. So could we be in a situation where your robot will only work if you allow the collection of data to be used for a variety of secondary uses, and what kind of transparency will we demand of companies?
So we've got something that was created to vacuum rooms, and instead it's vacuuming data, or it could.
Yeah, exactly.
So more broadly, and not to even single out that company, there's this potential for unintended consequences, or one design leads to a later application. Is that the kind of thing you've observed elsewhere, or seems common in the robotics world?
I would say it seems pretty common. And I mean, to be fair also to designers, right, the technology is in such a novel state right now that it's impossible, and it would be unfair to say you must anticipate all of the unexpected uses and outcomes. So I think that would be an unfair way to go, but it does point in the direction that thinking about the ethical, legal, and societal issues is an ongoing process that needs to happen at multiple stages throughout the life cycle of the robot. So it's not just something where you make the robot, you start to use it, and then you think, oh, oops, now what are we going to do? We have this potential privacy issue. That's something that we should be considering earlier on in the design process.
Absolutely. So this is arguably a room of the house, the backyard, and you have something to talk about there.
Right, so the backyard, and we could also still be talking about your living room, because there have been examples where people were observed in other rooms of their homes, but we can think of drones, right? And how they could be a tool that's used to look inside someone's home or give you the feeling of being watched. And what's interesting about the drone, with the first two examples, I was making reference to considerations that the industry sector, right, that companies should be taking in mind. And when you think about something like a drone, these are commercially available. These are off-the-shelf products that are easy to acquire. So we're not just talking about issues related to development. Now we're talking about use, and whether or not the citizen, the consumer, should be bound by rules of how you are allowed to use this. Because these drones have been and can be used to spy on individuals. Or, if you're just curious what your neighbor is up to, or if we're talking about younger generations, right, teenagers who are learning how to fly, that's a really cool tool, the kinds of things that you might see. But on a more darker note, there have been reported cases where women, it has changed the practice of stalking, and so women have been stalked through an individual using a drone. So it's, and of course that's the darker side. I'm not trying to say that all drones are going to be used for that, but it just makes us think whether or not, there should be policies or best practice that apply to the user and not just the company that's making the robot.
It does strike me that there's a continuum with these things, from the truly malicious use, like someone using a drone for stalking, to just someone with a lack of education. I was on a camping trip where some kid was flying his drone over my campsite, and I was ready to shoot down the thing with a crossbow. Instead, I calmed down and I found the kid, and he just didn't know. So there's maybe an education component that's missing when these new technologies are rolled out.
And actually, so this is a technology that, as I mentioned, will be used by, could be used by the average individual who wants to learn things. But we've also seen now that there have been some complications around airports. People are flying their drones around airports, and it has an impact on the schedule of the airplanes, whether or not they're allowed to land because they've seen a device, or whether they have to stay rotating around the airport.
Yes. So next room, you're ready to move into the bedroom setting.
Sure. So now this is a really interesting application of a robot that we might find in an individual's home, and that's sex robots. And it's still, quite a new technology. There's probably only about 5 companies around the world that are making these sex robots, but there are quite a few companies that are making sex dolls, and these are the precursors to the sex robot. So once you start integrating more technical components or AI to make the doll be able to speak and interact with you, then we're talking about a sex robot. And this is another case where there's no regulation or standards or policy on the technology. And this is an instance where, because it's so new, we need to have a conversation with the public about how we want this technology to be introduced. Is this something where you need a prescription to use it? Should it be strictly seen as a therapeutic tool, as a device to help people overcome a sexual trauma or some sort of terrible experience that they've had in their life? Or should this be, akin to a kind of blow-up doll that you can just go, or like your drone, you can just go and purchase one if you want. So really, for this application, it's about engaging the public. Because it's so new, we need to decide where we want to go with this technology. And there have been propositions that we should have a ban on this kind of technology. Do we want to go in that way, or do we want to allow them to see how things sort of roll out, but under careful consideration? And of course, there's a variety of issues that you can talk about when you're talking about sex robots. There's, social isolation, that people might be so in awe or, so ecstatic about interacting with their robot that they don't want to interact with humans anymore because it's too difficult. But one of the main considerations that we might think about is how, and this relates to all robots, but with sex robots, it's a really nice case study to use, how human-robot interactions could find their way into human-human interactions. So if you become used to treating the robot in a certain way, not asking for consent to have sex, or speaking to the robot in a certain way, or expecting that it interacts with you in a certain way, we could find that we become so used to interacting with the robot in a certain way, maybe we even prefer it, but that these tendencies or these interactions are then transferred over into human-human interactions. And so, there's research being done right now about whether or not you're allowed to harm a robot. Can you hit your robot, right? If it can't feel pain, and if it has no emotions, why not? Can you throw it down the stairs? Can you kick it? Can you do whatever you want to it? But, research is showing that when you treat the device in that way, it has the potential to have an impact on how, or desensitize you to how you might interact with other humans. So,
right, and there's a counter argument out there, which is that if you program a robot such that it protests about treating badly, it objects, hey, you can't do that to me. On one hand, maybe that's teaching people to behave a little bit more decently.
Right.
On the other hand, you've now created this robot that's sort of insisting on ethical standing,
right.
And you're maybe fostering that illusion that it really is alive.
Right.
And that also troubles some people. So how do you find the balance between those two things?
Yeah, well, so, and then with the robot being able to protest, and there's a whole range of issues that come out of that, because there are two considerations. The first one is the anthropomorphization of the robot. And so when you anthropomorphize something, it means that you think of a technology as if it were an animal or a human, and then you project onto it that this technology, your smartphone or your robot in this instance, can feel and can think like a human, and that has repercussions for how you treat it, right? So we have to be careful with what the robot will say and how it will interact, because we don't want to get ourselves caught up in thinking that the robot can actually feel these things. It's not feeling things the same way that we feel things. So we need to be careful in the kinds of activities that the robot, or the kinds of things the robot can say. But then the second train of thought is, there's a huge debate right now about whether or not robots should have rights, right? And so there was a recent case where a robot was granted citizenship in a country, and then the question is, well, what does citizenship entail? Does it mean that you are entitled to rights and protections and freedoms? And then what does that mean? Because we make the robots in the first place to be our kind of servants, right? The robot's vacuuming your home. The robot is doing these things for you that you don't want to do. So if the robot then has rights, is it allowed to decide whether or not it wants to do that? Can we make robots to do these dull, dirty, and dangerous things that we don't want to do?
You're saying as soon as we finally perfect the technology, we can't use it because
exactly.
it's ethically unsound.
Pretty much, yes.
What do you think, stepping back from sex robots, which I think many people would immediately have in a revulsion to, What about simply companion robots?
Yeah.
You know, if you could invent sort of an idealized robot friend that would be for people who are lonely, does that trouble you at all ethically?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, just to push back, there's a lot of people that aren't revolted by the idea of sex robots. There's a lot of people that are, you know, welcoming that idea. And there's sex brothels right now that are starting in different countries, or that are already starting, not for the sex robots, but for sex dolls, the precursors. So it is an idea that's sort of gaining in popularity and momentum, and we could see them more frequently. But returning to the idea of companionship with a robot, I think that we have to, so going back to what I said earlier, ethics is about the good life and what it means to have a good life and how we can achieve the good life. And companionship and relationships and social interactions are an important part of this. And so what does it mean when we are creating a technology to fulfill a role that has been traditionally a human role? That traditionally you get meaning from something, or from an interaction that you have with another human. And the reason why they can be so meaningful is they're challenging, but they are reciprocal. You know, you have to learn patience with another individual. You learn about being empathetic and compassionate by watching the suffering of another individual, or by listening, or by, you know, going through some of the mundane things that you might have to in a relationship. And what's interesting is that those are skills that are necessary for us to be good people and to live a kind of quote-unquote ethical life. So if you can make a companion robot in the way that helps you still acquire those skills and experience different moments in life that we consider part of our conception of the good life, then I would say, okay, let's go for it. Let's see what happens. But I would be very cautious about whether or not that is the kind of role that we should give to the technology. And I say that because robots in the hospital, for example, you know, you could think of a companionship robot in the hospital, but you can also think of robots for lifting patients, for bathing patients, for feeding patients. If the design is done in the right way so that the robot enhances the skills of the humans, helps the care workers, this is an incredible innovation to help and to create better care practices. But if it's done in a way where we try to replace the human-human contact with human-robot contact, then we might see a kind of breakdown in what really makes care so meaningful in the first place.
So we've got a little less than a minute left.
Okay.
Give me your quick take on how we can work towards an robotically ethically responsible future.
Okay. So I would say, you know, looking at robot ethics, it's not about how to make the robot an ethical agent. It shouldn't be about how do we make the robot decide what's good and bad, what's right and wrong. We humans are still struggling to figure it out, right? That is, the whole debate of ethics has been going on for centuries, and we don't know yet what is always right and what's always wrong. So doing robots responsibly is about maintaining responsibility, accountability with the humans behind the robots. And it also means that, you know, it requires that we understand what's happening between industry and academia, policymakers and NGOs. It requires that the public is aware of what's going on, the different kinds of innovations. And it requires transparency between companies and consumers. Consumers need to know what the company is doing and how the company is looking out for the best interests of the consumer.
That's great. Very well put. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.